To the macaroni.
Welcome, everyone. It is the 27th of May, and you're watching the House Committee on General and Housing. And let's see, do you have anyone online, any member of the committee online, Mary or Saudia? Rep Lamont is online. I don't see her. She is. So we have a quorum. And we
Here, sorry.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, we are hearing H106, which is an act relating to selling real property within a FEMA mapped flood hazard area. We passed out H106 to the Senate, and the Senate has sent us a proposal of amendment. Our task today is to review that proposal. You all have a copy of it in front of you, and to take a straw poll that we can report on the floor when it comes up. So we have our legislative counsel, Cameron Wood, our august legislative counsel with us today. Cameron, would you like to introduce yourself and take it away if you can get it up there?
Absolutely. For the record, Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I feel like I haven't been here.
I know we missed you badly.
Yeah.
Hi.
Ditto. It's wonderful to see you all. Okay. We are looking at H106, an act related to selling real property within a FEMA mapped flood hazard area. Mr. Chair, as you mentioned, this was passed out of this committee and out of the House. So I just went online and pulled up the as passed by House version just to do a quick run through, kind of reorient everybody with what was done in the bill as it came out of this committee and as it passed your body. If you recall, this is the section, this is in Title 27 related to property. So this is when selling part of real property, a seller shall provide the following information: whether the real property is located in a FEMA mapped flood hazard area, whether the real property is subject to flooding or flood damage, that's subsection 3. And then subdivision 4, whether the seller maintains flood insurance. Those are the requirements that went into effect last year. And so what you all did was you made some changes here. And again, this is as passed by House version. So we made some just changes in subsection C to make it read, make it the wording work better for the intent there. So there's no substantive changes. The key piece was in D, where you all added, if this is a defense, if a buyer brings an action for damages, if the seller, after reasonable attempt to identify whether the location of the real property is within a FEMA mapped special or moderate flood hazard area, notifies the buyer that the seller cannot reasonably determine if the real property is located within a flood hazard area, and notifies the buyer of the requirements of this subsection. That was the defense that you all put into statute to say, hey, if you have made that reasonable attempt, you've notified the buyer that you can't determine, here's the requirements of the section. That's a defense to somebody bringing damages against you. Okay. That was the change that you all made in the House. Now I'm going to move over to the Senate proposal of amendment. They did a strike all and inserted what we have here. First, they inserted a section 1, intent. It is the intent of the General Assembly to ensure that a buyer of real property is on notice regarding the flood risk associated with the purchase of the real property. Some of you may be asking why they put an intent section in and what does it mean? As I was discussing with the Senate Economic Development Committee, I was talking about some of the same things that I spoke with you all, whether or not to make these things retroactive. And when I brought this up to you all, we had a conversation about the constitutional concerns with that, making something retroactive in this case. And when you do make something retroactive, sometimes it's important to put either findings or intent language, because that's you all signaling to the courts, this is why we're doing this. This is the public policy that we're trying to accomplish by doing it. And it can give the courts information to understand and help justify why you're making changes retroactively. And that can help the court weigh in those situations some of the constitutional concerns that they may have, okay? The Senate did not make this retroactive. And so I told them, you really don't need intent language. You don't need findings. However, they thought it was best because you're making a change immediately after this went into effect. They just wanted to signal this is, the purpose of what we're doing here. So what does the intent section do? What's it going to actually accomplish in the real world? Nothing. Other than it's telling people this is the intent of what we're doing here. So it doesn't go in the green book, it's in session law. Somebody's not even gonna know it exists unless they go grab the white book or unless they go look up the act itself to read it. So just for those who were new. Okay, so then section 2, this is the same section you have. This is the meat of kind of what the Senate committee did. And as you can see right off the gate, or right out the front, they repealed the requirement to notify a seller, or excuse me, notify the buyer whether the property is within a flood map area. And instead they replaced it with this sub 3 here, bottom of page 1, top of page 2. So instead of notifying the buyer whether the property is in this area, you are to give the buyer a physical or electronic copy or a digital link of the official flood insurance rate map as published by FEMA, or notice that the flood insurance rate map is unavailable for the affected area of the community in which the real property is located. The reason they did this, I can't speak to, their justification, but there was conversation in the committee about the fact that a buyer can make the determination just as easily as a seller. And so, does it make more sense to simply provide the buyer with the information so the buyer has it? So repealing the requirement to notify whether it's in the area and simply replacing it with, I shouldn't say simply, replacing it with a copy of the map itself. And then as we're moving down on page 2 here, what would be a new subdivision 4 remains the same. So whether the property's been subject to flooding while you own the property, that remains. And then whether the seller maintains, and then they're proposing to add, or is required by federal or state law to maintain. Those in theory could be 2 different things. And then the same amendments in the subsection C that you all had, just to make that language a little better. And then their effective date is September 1 of 2025, as opposed to passage. That is the proposed change.
Questions of council, or shall we, well, if there,
Not
I was
of
going to
council.
suggest first questions of our legislative council, and then let's bring it to us for discussion. So any questions? Yes.
Does it change any requirements for land?
No. So there is, let's see if I still have it. Last year, you all also made changes. Okay, so landlords have to disclose in advance, and sorry, I don't have this up in front of me. I'm reading from Act 181. These are the changes that you all made last year. In addition to adding this into when you're selling real property, you also added a section in the, I believe this is in the residential rental agreement chapter, that requires a landlord to disclose to a tenant as part of the rental agreement whether any portion of the premise is located in a FEMA map special flood hazard area. And then you also added in a requirement that a mobile home park has to notify whether a lot within the park is wholly or partially located in a flood hazard area.
Was there did we put anything in that dealt with the underlying problem that in some cases there's no map or they're unclear?
No, sir. There's just a straight requirement in those instances for the landlord of the mobile home park owner to notify. You did add in that the Department of Housing and Community Development has to develop a model form for them to use. But outside of that, there's no condition. But there's also, to be clear though, I don't recall, and as I was doing a little bit of research on this, I don't recall there's any consequence. There's nothing that presumably if a mobile home owner was renting a lot and the mobile home park owner didn't disclose, then I think you potentially have the right of that individual to bring some sort of claim against for damages. just kind of, based on standard warranty requirements and, requirements for landlord to notify under that, but it's nothing in statute that they would be able to point to.
But is there, I might ask a question, although are you done with your question? Do you think it's reasonable, yeah, if you have an opinion, would it be reasonable for, who is it who has to issue the form?
The landlords or the mobile home park,
No, who's creating the form?
Department of Housing.
You think it would be possible for the Department of Housing to put on the form the don't know section? Or cannot determine section under this statute? If you think that it would be consistent?
I think so. I don't see anything in here that would prohibit them from doing it or, make them run afoul. I mean, it just says the Department of Housing shall develop a model form for the notice provided that shall include the information required.
Yeah,
And so I think if they added on there that it's unable to determine or map doesn't exist or something to that effect, I don't see how that's the department running afoul of the requirement here.
okay, so the department could do that. They don't have to, but they could.
Yes. In my opinion, I think that they could.
Oh, it's your opinion. Well, we know what we think it's different.
So,
That takes you nowhere, just for the record, everyone.
Yes,
So just to clarify, so Ashley, you're pointing out to what would be an inconsistency between a sale or what's in the statute as opposed to
Correct.
what's on statute for what landlords and mobile home owners, law owners have to do.
I need one less discussion.
this would
Any other
include-
questions?
yeah.
Of council?
no,
Yes, Debbie.
council.
Well, I mean, I might just be totally confused, but sometimes you talk about just flood insurance and then you always also talk about FEMA. So are the flooding, are you talking about just floods from FEMA or anytime that property, like in the 100-year floods that we get also? That
So-
aren't from,
So the requirements here are if you're in a FEMA, the current requirement, if the real property is located in a flood hazard area as determined by FEMA.
okay, so
Because
it's just.
FEMA is the entity that makes that determination. But separate from that, you may not be in a flood hazard area, but your house has flooded.
Mhm.
And so those are two separate notice requirements that are currently in the law. But the requirement here under the new 4 is you only have to notice whether the property was subject to flooding while, you possess the property. Because you can't, you as the seller aren't going to know. It's possible but, you're not guaranteed to know that something didn't possess it. So we look at that as two separate things.
Okay.
I think under existing law, just the general law of the subject, you have to you have to act in good faith.
Oh, yeah.
Which means if you know that it was flooded, if you actually know that it was flooded before you owned it, you
Mhm.
gotta tell them.
No,
Yeah.
definitely, but
Yeah, but.
neighbors came and running over, it's flooded 100 years ago. I'm like, okay.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to be clear as far as the mobile home part of it, because the majority of people that live in a mobile home lease the land. But a majority own their home. When they're selling their home, the co-op or the owner really doesn't get involved with the sale part of it.
Right.
So whose responsibility and how would the responsibility become the landowners?
So two things that this body, the General Assembly, did last year. They added a requirement that as part of the lease of the lot, the mobile home park has to notify the mobile home owner, person who's going to put their home on that lot,
Okay,
has to notify them whether any part of the mobile home park is within a flood map area.
when they're putting a new home.
When they're putting the place when they're leasing that lot. The other piece that was added in was if you're selling your mobile home, so now not the park owner, but the mobile home owner. When you're selling that mobile home, you have to notify the buyer if there's any flooding of the home, not the park. So you, as if you're selling that mobile home itself, you have the language is slightly different, but you have pretty much the same obligation as the owner of real property. You have to notify if the house has flooded.
And what if you don't know? Because what Mark said about, there needs to be something,
If
because
you don't know, then you don't, then you're not obligated because you legally don't know.
okay,
Right. The way the language reads is, in case of a mobile home as defined and references back to a mobile home definition, the seller shall provide to a prospective buyer a written disclosure of any flooding history or flood damage to the mobile home known to the seller. Right. Similar here, while the seller possesses the property, like, you need to have actual knowledge and then you have an obligation.
Okay, discussion.
I will be supporting this. As articulate as it can be.
Are you saying we should concur with the
Yes.
Senate?
I would like to concur with the Senate proposal of the amendment.
I second.
We don't even need a motion. We're gonna take a straw poll.
All right,
Right.
But I wanna
but I
know,
wanted to kick us off saying that I'm down with it.
yes,
I think we should put a pin in it. I mean, besides this amendment, I think we should make a note to ourselves to
pick this up.
revisit this, because if they do away with FEMA or if they restructure FEMA,
We may not have
it's a
maps.
completely different thing, yeah. Or we may have maps, but they will age very quickly as our environment changes.
Right.
I don't know. It seems like it would take the same amount of time to revise it down the road as to implement it down the road. You know what I mean? If we wait to pass this, you mean?
No,
put a
I'm
pin
saying
in it?
pass it.
Come back and.
Oh, okay, and put a pin in it
Touch-
to revisit
Yeah,
it.
check whether,
Okay.
check whether
I see, yeah, that
it
makes.
still works, yeah.
Other comments by members of the committee? Yes,
I love the intent language, and, I think that this clarifies more clearly that we're not entirely passing the buck just because it's challenging in the real world to figure this out, and I think it's, yeah, this is not a question for Cameron anymore, but just in general for others that may be in the room. I'd like to just make sure that, will this work in the real world for the sales? It seems like it
go
would.
ahead and identify yourself.
Great, thanks. Peter Tucker for the Vermont Association of Realtors. And, not only do I think that this is a really effective solution, when I talked to the chair of our forums committee, who's incredibly knowledgeable about, just how, how it works on the ground. She said, look, we need to be better than just getting rid of the FEMA flood maps. We can do other things that will be beneficial. And I think that this is really a goal to accomplish that by saying the seller discloses to the buyer, or the seller gives to the buyer a copy of the map. If we do that with drinking water, if there's a well, we do it with lead paint. There's a number of different pamphlets that go, not to really require the seller to make an informed decision, but rather to say, put the buyer on notice that these things are things the buyer should be considering. And I believe that that's where we ended up with this. Still a challenge for a buyer that doesn't have computer capabilities to produce a map or link the person to a map. But, that's a factual thing. I can go on the FEMA website and find a property on that. And, versus trying to interpret a map, merely providing a map is something that I think realtors can help their sellers with. We don't want to be subject to liability, but, for trying to guess at what the maps mean. But this is really just provide a document, which is what we do all the time. So we feel good about it. I appreciate the work of the committee. And, I will say, from Barrow's point of view, FEMA just dismissed 20% of their workforce and fired all their top management in the past week. So, the ability of FEMA to upgrade their maps is certainly in question. And just lastly, the reason that I think we really work to address this portion of the bill was the liability on the seller. This is specifically laid out in the legislation, and we didn't look to change that language at all. In rental properties or in trailer parks, there is not a liability section, which doesn't mean somebody can bring an action. But, the real hammer was in the selling section. And that's why we wanted to make sure that sellers wouldn't have to become civil engineers to interpret FEMA maps. They just don't have that expertise. This way they provide the map, the buyer can do their research as well. And everybody's on notice what the area looks like.
Thank you, Peter. Other members of the, want to say anything? I personally find it a rather elegant solution. I like the idea of handing a map to the buyer. Certainly puts the buyer on notice. And if the the buyer says, I can't see my property on here, well, then they're at least on notice that they have to maybe inquire a little further or whatever. So,
Thank
are
you.
we ready to have a straw poll? All those who think we should concur with the Senate, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Saudia?
Is my hand up? Can you see it or no?
Well, we believe you. 9. Am I counting right?
Yeah.
9 votes,
9.
10, 11. Yeah, okay. So it's 9-0-2.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we, at this point, just before we go off live, tomorrow, the 28th, we have nothing before the floor as of this moment, but as you've heard from leadership, please watch your phone. This is a time when we sit around waiting on the one hand and things happen on the other. In the afternoon, we're going to have 2 witnesses to continue the discussion of dilapidated and vacant homes. In the afternoon at 1 o'clock, we're going to hear from Josh Hanford and Kirby Keaton. And, one of the things that came out is how long it takes to do a tax sale. Well, what I hope we can explore is, are there ways to shorten that without abridging the rights of people who really do live in the house and just have come on hard time? So that'll be at 1 o'clock. Watch. So we, at this point, have no need to have any committee action before the floor, which is at 10 o'clock. It's not what it used to be. It's at